We are now heading to the keynote lecture number 2. Keynote speaker is Ortwin Renn. Ortwin is professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment, and he is dean of the economic and social science department at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. Ortwin, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Danke sehr mal.
Well, thank you very much, Walter, for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted to be tonight here with you, and I hope I would give you a little bit of an overview about the facts on risk, about risk perceptions, and what that means that our perceptions do not always match the facts, and how we can get around it. Let me start with a little cartoon that I found in the internet, which I think is very telling. We see the two cavemen here, and one is saying, something is just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all got a plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. So apparently life expectancy in those days were not very good. So what is the situation today, and how can we compare to these cavemen? Well, there is some good news out there. And the good news out, if we take 172 countries out of the 193 have a rising life expectancy, and you can see there are quite a few differences when we differentiate between the low, medium, and high income countries. But anyway, there is progress even when minimal life expectancy is taken as a reference point. So we have an increase from 36 years to 47, the medium 68 to 72, and in countries like Switzerland here, we have now a life expectancy of around 85 years. So this is something we can say it's very good news and tells us something about the distribution of risks over time and space. As a matter of fact, the less risks there are, the less people will have their biological lifespan realized. Well, that is the good news, and I think sometimes good also to tell a little bit about good news. That's overall the life lost over time has increased, and there's a remarkable improvement over the last 50 years. However, there's also bad news, and the bad news is that the gap in risk experience between rich and poor countries and between rich and poor people is increasing. So in spite of the fact that life expectancy in general is going up, we still face a strong disequity or inequity experience in terms of risk. And we can see this, those are just some numbers, maybe many of you are familiar with them. The number of deaths between 16 and 60, so before any biological life for humans would end anyway, and we can see that around more than half of the female population in low-income countries will not reach their biological age, but around 0.5% of females in high-income countries will have the same fate. So we can see a major difference, and the problem is that from 1990 to 2009, that number has worsened for low-income countries, and it has improved for anyone else. So there you can see, just with one number, the main gap between life expectancy and the possibility of experiencing risk is highly dependent on where you live. If you live in Switzerland, your possibility to live until 80 years is something like 73%. So this is a very good number. If you live in Nigeria, it's less than 28. Now, if you go back to the top killers in the world, I know that this is a very difficult picture to draw, but specifically addressing a natural hazard and technological hazard community, I think it's good to put things in perspective, because as much as natural hazard is an important element, I will come back to it, the top killers are not natural hazards. We should be aware of that. If we have high-income countries, the top killers, that around 65% of all the death toll below 70 is due to smoking, drinking, unbalanced nutrition, and lack of exercise. So these are the 4 common killers in high-industrialized, high-income countries. If we go to medium-income countries, we see that the picture is changing. Again, unbalanced nutrition is something which is pretty much on top. We still have a high toll of infections, including HIV. Then one that is extremely important, and I know, Loretto, you're here, occupational health and safety. It's number 3 in these medium countries. Then comes smoking, then accidents, specifically car accidents, and then homicide. And if you go to low-income countries, it is clearly dominated by infections. TBC, malaria, HIV, diarrheal disease, unclean water, then malnutrition. Occupational health and safety is getting to be one of the largest killers, even in large-income countries. And let me go quickly to these 2 ones. Globally, 2.3 million people die due to work-related risks, more than those caused by water, malaria, traffic accidents, earthquakes, or other natural risks. The biggest killers, cardiovascular diseases and cancer, have a substantial component caused by work-related risks. And ILO, as you're probably well aware of, has estimated that 4% of the GDP is lost due to these risks. And if you think about car accidents, around 1.2 million people are killed each year in road crashes, and 50 million are injured. So this is kind of the fairly high numbers that we're looking at. However, this is all not inevitable. These are things you can really improve, as much as I come later to natural hazards. Now, I just took Germany, not to say the Germans are very good in doing things, but just how one can change the bad numbers into fairly good numbers with the right effort. And specifically, and that's part of the main message, with a more equitable policy. We had, 1960, around 5,000 fatal accidents at work. Now, 2013, all of Germany experiences 478 fatal accidents at work. So around a decrease by 90%. Compare this, for example, to Brazil, 12,239 fatal accidents at work. Of course, there are more people, 200 million people, so around little more than double than Germany, but again, that number is more than 10 times as much. If you look at traffic accidents, the same picture, 20,000, 1972 in Germany, now 3,339. Again, you can lower the number of car accidents considerably if you do the right things. So policy does work. This is basically policy plus technology, plus giving the benefits also to the poor people. Those are the 3 main messages here. And if you look, for example, Nigeria, 34 deaths per car accident per 100,000, Germany 4, and the Germans drive 25 times more than the Nigerians. So in spite, well, the Germans are always car drivers, you know that. Anyway, so this is a very substantial statistical data here telling us, yes, there is possibility for reduction. And I want to put this out because I think the same message can be sent out for natural disasters. Now we come to natural disasters. We have around an average of 104,000 people being killed in natural disasters, so that is compared to occupational health, to infections, a fairly, and in quotation mark, low number, but it's much higher than, for example, homicide. So the average toll per country per year is 376, when you take all the countries. Now, if you go to high-income countries, it's 180, Europe actually 22. If you go to medium-income countries, it's 413. Low-income countries, it's 944. So we see again that income is one of the major variables that determine how much people are losing their life in natural disasters. It's not the case that poor people are more exposed to natural disasters. That's not the case. As a matter of fact, the regression line is even the opposite, slowly against income. However, the losses in terms of lives, not in terms of money, that's different, but in terms of lives are within the poor countries and within the poor populations. Now, the interesting thing about this, and that is my second part here, is that the safer people live, for example, in Germany or in Switzerland, the more they are worried about safety and risk. And that's what we call the risk paradox. And that was the reason actually why Walter asked me to give this talk, because I just had a book out with this title, The Risk Paradox. And the risk paradox can be again highlighted in two facets that I would like to convey to you. 73% of the German population believes that their life has become riskier and more dangerous over the last 3 decades, but only 42% of the Indian population. Nothing could be more wrong in terms of who lives at risk and who doesn't. Concerns about growing risk are most widely distributed among middle-income families. They have the highest concerns about risks, followed by high-income families, and last, low-income families. And a part of this is that satisfaction with life is what we can determine as a gap between what we expect and what we perceive as reality. If we don't expect anything, we think that's normal. So the risks that we face are normal, so we are not worried about it. If we perceive reality differently from what it is, and that's typically true for high-income countries and for people with fairly high income, we believe that the reality is worse than it is. So those are the two elements here that are important: expectations and perceived reality. Now, when we think about risk perceptions, just two things that are important to remember. First one is that our behavior is guided by perception. So we behave according to our perception. What we believe is true, what we believe is causally connected. It is not guided by scientific knowledge about facts, and I think Margareta pointed out quite clearly, if we all be run by perceptions, we may run in the wrong directions. Perceptions, secondly, are a well-studied subject of social science research. They differ from what experts assess, but they follow fairly consistent patterns and rationales. And I would like to point out 4 of these major rationales, more or less, to tell you a little bit about how risk perception works and what are the drivers for sometimes also the biases that are associated with perceptions. And sometimes perceptions are very good, but only for specific situations. The first thing is that humans are based on fairly simple causality models. The evolutionary advantage of human beings is that we make causal connections, and we make them quickly. So if we see an antenna outside of this room and we have a headache, we believe that the electromagnetic field is causing our headache because we see it, and everything what's closely related to us, either in time or in space, is seen as a cause. For everything that's complex, that's not true. And for one of the reasons is that complex causal connections are very difficult to grasp for intuitive thinking, and we always look for the little conspiracy or for the little cause around the corner that helps us to understand the world. Secondly, and that is related to this, is that most of our dangers today that we face are not, or very few of them, really related to personal experience. That's even true for many of the natural hazards. So we have to trust somebody that that person give us correct information. And because we live in abundance of information societies, we get all kinds of different informations, and so we don't know whom to trust. And very often, a lot of psychological research has confirmed that if we don't believe any of the sources, we don't want either the activity or we deny the risk, or the other way is if we believe someone who really exaggerates the risk, we are really believing that and fearing that. And that is totally, or it's partially amplified by the way that our media works and the way that our experience of virtual reality has shaped our, let's say, second-hand experience. With around 7 billion people, we have a disaster every day. And that disaster is right in our living room, on our TV, in our computers. So we have the feeling that something is happening every minute. And that may be true, but it is not different from what we have seen maybe 10 or 15 or 100 years ago. We just didn't report about it. And this constant reporting about issues and facts, about catastrophes, about homicide, about all kinds of things, has shaped our second-hand experience. And a lot of high-income people believe that the risk is much higher because they see it every night on TV, and the low-income people who may not have the access to all of this believe the risks are lower. And lastly, there's a confusion about plurality of truth claims, meaning that there's so many different opinions that we don't know whom to trust anymore, and then we go back to these intuitive heuristics that I mentioned before. Now, looking at this, I think it's very important to see that there is this gap between what I can see, the statistical numbers, and we can debate about them. I mean, they all have their problems, but I think they give the right magnitude of order. And secondly, we have these perceptions. And because of these perceptions, a lot of policies are related to something what people perceive as being very bad and not to what I think we see as the roots or drivers of some of these very negative figures that I showed to you. For example, I know a lot of Chinese people here. There's a lot of commotion in China about food safety, but in general, food safety is not a big problem in China, much less than most Chinese believe. But in a recent survey in China, around 78% of the Chinese population said food safety is the most dangerous thing in China. Well, if you look at the figures, it's not. And so it's very important to see that sometimes we base our policies on just perceptions, and sometimes I think it's good to look into the real drivers. And I would like to point out 3 major drivers for these risk challenges. I'll do this fairly quickly. I mean, this would, of course, take much more time. The first one is most risks are, or many of the risks, natural risks, and also human-induced risks, are caused by the high intensity of human interventions into the natural environment. Only since 1950, we really have the ability to influence geophysical circular events in the atmosphere. Think about climate change, think about the water cycle, and many other natural events. Secondly, a major problem is the lack of adequate governance of collective actions. So the governance of collective actions is inadequately administered in the world, and this kind of governance deficits have a lot of problems. And thirdly, there are the side effects of modernization and globalization, specifically in efficiency on one hand side, but also optimizing efficiency on the expense of other very important developments. Let me go briefly into these 3 again. Human interventions in nature. As I pointed out, since 1915, we as humans influence global geophysical cycles, specifically carbon cycle, but many others too. And we make an experiment with the whole world, with the whole planet, where we don't know the conclusion. We don't know what comes out of this. Secondly, we have an exceeding sink capacity for absorbing human-induced waste, the whole pollution problem, but also the waste problem, and very problematic land use patterns that endanger biodiversity, sustainable living conditions, but also invite more impacts in terms of natural hazards. Governance deficits. Well, the first one is inability to deal prudently with common resources, just again, climate, biodiversity, but also the capital market. A second point is that we tend in the economic system to optimize efficiency for partial markets over looking into resilience and fairness. So this is a very important element. The whole capital crisis that we just had on all the capital markets is we have really optimized efficiency in one sector on the expense of all the other ones. We still sustain corrupt and ineffective governance systems that just play or turn into a very immobility effect and a failure to resolve conflicts by peaceful means. Well, we don't need to think about the examples that come to us immediately. And the third one, modernization of side effects, or the side effects of modernization. We have an increasing gap between rich and poor. That's true individually as well as collectively, and richer is safer. That's what I said before. There is a high vulnerability to IT-dependent systems, all the cyberspace problems that we are looking at, high interconnectedness, high vulnerability. And thirdly, I would love to talk more about this. There's a lot of cultural identity and trust in the future, which also makes us believe that some risks are higher than others, but it also creates a risk of its own kind. Now, what can we do about it? And I know that it's, huge picture up here, but I would like to point out 4 elements that I think are very important. Number one is, I think we need to resurrect the welfare economics. We need to have a vision of a socially and environmentally bounded market economy. I think we have taken a farewell from this model because we believe that it's not efficient enough, but efficiency is not the only target for human beings. Efficiency is important, but it's not the only one. And optimizing efficiency and cost of everything else leads to disaster in all senses. So we need boundaries, social boundaries as well as environmental boundaries for market economies. We need new governance strategies combining effectiveness, so have good expertise, and I'm very glad that Margareta pointed this out. We need good science in there because we have to know what is effective and what's not effective, and perception doesn't give us that. We need efficiency because natural efficiency is very important, which is the corporate sector very legitimate to do that. We need more resilience in terms of governmental actions, and we need more fairness in distributing the resources, and I think that is specifically also the task of the NGOs. We need to include more direct citizen participation in developing the live world. This seems to be in contrast to what I said about perception, but interesting enough, the closer people are to their own environment, the more accurate are the picture about what is of real concern and what's not. So in that sense, it's very important to give more power to local communities in order to give them the ability to govern themselves. On larger participatory processes, it's a little bit more difficult, but also feasible. And we need more effective educational programs that make people understand their own biases and misperceptions and lead them to a better understanding of sustainable lifestyles. This is not to say that people are not grasping the reality, but it's very important that they understand their own mechanisms of perception so that they worry about the things they should worry about and not about something that they believe they should worry about. So these are 4 of the main lessons that I would like to impose on you at this keynote speech. So come back to welfare economics, because I think it is a model that has worked in Europe in many times, and it is still there to work. And we have, I think, taken away from that very important model some of its real support, and it needs to be resurrected. We need new governance strategies, combining expertise, corporate sector, governments, and NGOs. We need to include more citizen participation, and we need to have a better education towards sustainability. Let me close with a quote of Kofi Annan about sustainability. He wrote, "Sustainability is often misunderstood. It does not mean securing what we have. The focus is not on conservation, but on innovation and development. The world needs change, yet this change must obey a different rationale, and this is the paradigm of justice with respect to the present and the future generations." Thank you very much.